Full house. Terrific. Welcome, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Very delighted to have the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, here to launch the Free the 20 campaign to draw attention to the plight of women political prisoners and other prisoners of concern. Throughout September, the department will highlight 20 individual cases of women prisoners from around the world who are unjustly imprisoned, featuring one case per business day. And these women will be featured on social media accounts for Ambassador Power and the U.S. mission to the UN, and will be profiled on www.humanrights.gov. So without further ado, Ambassador.
Good afternoon. 20 years ago, 189 governments and approximately 30,000 non-governmental organizations, activists from around the globe, convened in Beijing for a world conference to advance gender equality and women's rights. The U.S. delegation was led by then First Lady Hillary Clinton, who set the tone not only for the conference, but also for a generation of advocacy on women's rights when she declared that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. After 2 weeks of intense negotiations, the 189 countries adopted the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, an ambitious roadmap for empowering women and promoting women and girls' human rights everywhere. On September 27th, 20 years after the Beijing Declaration, nations from around the world will take part in another high-level conference, this time at the United Nations in New York, with the aim of agreeing upon a new set of concrete commitments to advance women's rights for the next 20 years. The discussion will look both at the areas where the world has made meaningful progress and those where we have not. Like Beijing, the conference will be ambitious in its breadth and aims to include a diverse set of voices. But there will be some women whose critically important voices will be missing from the dialogue around the Beijing Plus 20 conference. Voices that would add a lot to discussions, not only about advancing women's rights, but all human rights. Women who have worked to promote freedom of expression and assembly, to ensure people's right to basic health care and education, and to defend children, refugees, and other vulnerable members of our societies. I am talking about the voices of women political prisoners and other prisoners of concern. Today, we are here to launch a campaign to recognize 20 of those women, women who should be advocating for women's empowerment and part of the discussions around the conference in New York in 3 weeks, rather than being behind bars. We are calling them the Beijing Plus 20, and every weekday leading up to the Beijing Plus 20 conference, we are going to share the story of one of these women in greater detail. Their names, who they are, where they are from, why they have been unjustly locked up, and the governments that are depriving them of their freedom. Governments that will be sending delegations to the Beijing Plus 20 conference in New York. These are just 20 out of the many women who are being deprived of their freedom and the right to participate in the Beijing Plus 20 conference. In naming these women, we are sending a message to their governments and others like them. If you want to empower women, don't imprison them on the basis of their views or on the basis of the rights that they are fighting for. Free these 20 women and free the countless women and girls like them behind bars, because these 20 women only represent a tiny fraction of the women currently being unjustly imprisoned. And the governments detaining them are just a handful of the governments around the world that are locking up women for exercising their fundamental freedoms. In naming these women, we are also seeking to send a message to the 20 prisoners and their families and to others like them. We have not forgotten about you. We will keep pressing for your governments to free you. We will continue to remind people of what is lost when you are excluded not only from the conversations like the one coming up in New York, but from your communities and your societies. We will insist on reminding the world how much we lose when your voices are silenced, today and every day that you are behind bars. The first of the 20 is Wang Yu, a 44-year-old prisoner in the country where the historic 1995 Beijing conference was held, China. A commercial lawyer by training, Wang's activism was sparked in 2008 when employees at a train station refused to let her board a train with her ticket. After demanding the right to board, Wang was assaulted by several men and then, even though she was the one who had been beaten, convicted to 2.5 years in prison for what was called intentional assault. She later told a reporter, quote, "After my miscarriage of justice, I wanted to improve China's human rights system," end quote. Wang did that by taking on the cases of clients who other lawyers feared to represent, such as Ilham Tohti, a prominent Uyghur scholar eventually sentenced to life in prison, Cao Xuanli, a woman human rights activist who died in March 2014 after reportedly being denied medical treatment while in detention, and those who are known as the Five Feminists, young women who were detained in advance of International Women's Day in March of this year for planning a campaign against sexual harassment. For her work, Wang has been harassed, threatened, and smeared in the state-run media. On July 9th, 2015, Wang herself was detained. So was her husband, along with their 16-year-old son. Wang and her husband remain in prison where they have been denied regular access to a lawyer in custody and have not yet been charged. Their son was released but is under constant surveillance and has been barred from leaving the country. When at least 159 Chinese lawyers and activists signed a petition calling for Wang's release, many of them were detained as well. Responding to attacks against her in the state-run press, Wang once wrote, quote, "I believe that during this time of enlightenment and rapid development of the internet, any shameful attempt to smear me is doomed to fail," end quote. She said, quote, "The truth cannot be long hidden," end quote. In raising Wang's case today and others like it in the days to come, we aim to help her and others expose some of that truth. Let me repeat her name. It is Wang Yu. We will continue to repeat Wang Yu's name and that of other women like her over the coming days. Women like the brave Azeri journalist Kadia Ismailova, another one of the 20, who just today was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. To the media, we urge, write about these cases. To members of these women's communities and to our own communities, we urge, take up these cases as your own and demand their release. And to the governments imprisoning these 20 individuals, we urge, if you want to empower women, start by releasing these women. Don't deprive your societies and the world of these women's voices. Thank you, and I will now take a few questions.
Go ahead, Matt.
I've got one logistical one and a technical one, and then a more substantive one. The North Korean prisoner, is that a composite, or is you have actually someone in mind? You just don't want to endanger even more by naming her. That's the technical question.
Okay, I'll take all your questions.
And then the other one is you've got 3 from Ethiopia on here, 3 from China. I'm curious, the National Security Advisor was just in China. The Chinese president is making a state visit here. And the president, our president, was just in Ethiopia where he made some comments praising its democracy. I'm just wondering if you see a discord there. And then lastly, are there no more women political prisoners in Cuba? Or why no one from Cuba?
Okay.
That's it.
Is that all?
That's it.
Okay. First on DPRK, I will say that there are more than 100,000 political prisoners in North Korea that we know about. And the conditions in the network of prisons in North Korea are unspeakable. The risk to any specific individual in those prisons excessive. And so all things considered, the judgment was made, number one, there are so many political prisoners that singling any one woman out, or girl out for that matter, in a way wouldn't reflect the scope and the scale of the challenge, and two, again, that the risk could be substantial to that individual. It's a composite. On the second question regarding China and Ethiopia, I think, in fact, what this campaign, which is an administration-wide campaign that everyone in this administration is very enthusiastic about and very sincerely committed to, really reflects the centrality of human rights to our relationship with these countries. We, with both China and Ethiopia, and I see this every day at the United Nations, have incredibly productive and important business that we do together around collective security challenges and around a whole set of shared interests. At the same time, the human rights issues in countries, regardless of who they are and regardless of how productively we work with them in other realms, need to be raised. And they are, as President Obama said on his trip to Ethiopia, the full potential of Ethiopia will not be unleashed and unlocked until journalists are able to report on what's going in the country freely, and credible opposition candidates are able to participate in elections. I mean, he said that on his trip, and Ambassador Rice's trip, National Security Advisor Rice's trip to China in advance of the Xi visit had human rights as one of the key agenda items. So this is very much in keeping with administration-wide commitments and the tradition of raising these issues repeatedly, seeking outcomes that, as this poster behind me reflects, outcomes that we have not yet achieved. And so we will keep raising until we see progress in these areas, significant progress. In terms of any specific country, I mean, there are a lot of political prisoners and a lot of women political prisoners around the world. We are doing one prisoner per day, again, for representing 1 year between now and Beijing in 1995. The specific inclusion of several from one country is no specific sign of anything, nor is the exclusion from another. You'll see a pretty diverse range of governments represented here. And all I would say is that we were looking for representative prisoner cases. We did a lot of consultation to select this group. Oftentimes that was with NGOs as well as with our own embassies, and people were a little closer to where these individuals are being held. In some cases, we engaged via our embassies or NGOs with the families of people that we were considering profiling, and some were not enthusiastic about being profiled, and that was a very, of course, a dispositive factor.
Okay. But it's not the case that the administration does not believe there are any...
We are not pulling our punches on any particular country.
Did National Security Advisor Rice raise the case of Wang Yu or of any other specific political prisoners in China on her last trip? And do you expect the president to raise Wang Yu or any other specific individuals when he meets with President Xi next or later this month? And then secondly, if those kinds of cases are not raised at the very highest level, why should the Chinese or any other government take your concerns seriously?
Thank you. I'm not in a position here to disclose private diplomatic communications that Ambassador Rice has had just over the course of the last week. And she's gone from China to Pakistan, is now up in the Arctic, so I also haven't had a chance to speak with her. But as I said earlier, human rights was a key core issue on her trip, and it is going to be a key core issue when President Xi visits Washington. I can, again, not at this point speak to what our plans are vis-a-vis the visit. We're working a lot of elements through even as we speak. But it has been the practice in any prior trip, certainly that I've had any insight into, that the president has raised a set of specific cases. and I would expect that to be the case on this trip as well. In terms of who will make it onto the list, these are extremely important cases, as is evinced here by the entire national security apparatus standing behind this list of prisoners. So I would have every expectation that these individuals would be on the list, but again, can't be a prophet here at this point.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Are we likely to see a list of Palestinian women prisoners on this, added to this list? I mean, some have languished for decades in Israeli prison, even giving childbirth while in prison. There's one in particular, a Palestinian legislator, Khalid Jarrah, who has been imprisoned for defying Israeli orders to be deported to Jericho from Ramallah. Could you comment on that?
I'm not familiar again with the specifics of the case, so I can't comment on that. I would just say again, this list is a representative list, not an exhaustive list. I also want to stress that this is not the sum total of our efforts on political prisoners around the world by any means. This is a group of women prisoners. It's not by any means close to a complete list of women prisoners. So it would be very misleading to think that somehow this is the sum total of our bilateral efforts or even our multilateral efforts to secure either more humane treatment or the release of particular political prisoners.
So this does not represent the dismissal of the fact that there are Palestinian women in Israeli prisons today.
Again, I'd want to speak to the facts of a specific case, which I'm not in a position to do.
Last question. Go ahead.
As you said, Ambassador, there are many political prisoners, and I'm just intrigued to know what the criteria that you chose to profile 20. You mentioned or alluded to say that it was a recommendation from the embassy or their families, etc. And are these all political prisoners held by governments, and therefore you're calling on governments? And what about the women who are held by militias or armed group, like, for example, Razan Zaytoun, who's a very famous Syrian activist?
Again, just to underscore, we have lots of different venues and vehicles for raising a whole series of cases that are not reflected by the image behind me and that will not be reflected by the specifics associated with this Beijing Plus 2020. So whether that's male political prisoners, whether it's a whole host of other women political prisoners, whether it's prisoners who are in the hands of militia or terrorist groups and so forth, we're raising those on a daily basis in different channels, trying to secure release. This is an effort to lift up in a way the welfare of basically the whole community of political prisoners by choosing 20 over the course of this 20-day period. So it's not intended to be exclusionary. It's intended, again, to be representative, illustrative, and of course it's intended to focus attention on these very specific cases. In terms of your very good and fair question about sort of the selection process and so forth, I mean, as you'll see as we roll out each of the cases each day, every prisoner that we have chosen to profile in this 20-day campaign has a specific story, and we wanted to lift up a range of different profiles of political prisoners. You might ask, well, why have a few from one country? Why not have 20 countries represented? If again, the facts of a particular case, if the family was enthusiastic, or if NGOs thought that there was actually potentially a chance to secure a release by raising up the profile, we didn't want to let the fact that a couple other prisoners from that country were on the list disqualify somebody. So it was, sort of more of an art than a science, I would say. But we felt that this together was a strong list of individuals who would both reflect their own experiences and the tremendous work that women are doing all around the world in civil society, in opposition, in media, in their own communities, in healthcare, in lawyering, you name it. But we also thought this would be a good representative group for those who aren't actually depicted in the campaign itself.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Thanks again.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mark.
You guys want to get started?
Yeah.
No 10-minute break, Matt, or?
Huh?
I'm just kidding. I'm teasing you, buddy.
I might need,
I know, you're not.
I might need a nap. No, not from that. No, that wasn't intended about, that was intended
Yeah, no,
about
I know.
my last night of lack of sleep.
Touche. Great. I have nothing at the top, so I will take your questions.
Can I ask a logistical question about the speech tomorrow?
Sure.
Why is he still giving it?
Is that a logistical question?
Yeah, I mean, is he still going to go to Philly and do the speech when he doesn't really need to? It looks like the intended audience, or maybe the two main intended members of the audience have come out today and said they support the deal.
Well, look, there's many different elements of the Iran deal, and in fact, making the case both to Congress, but also the broader issue here is making the case to the Iran deal to the American public.
Okay, what I'm
And
trying to
so,
get at, he and the rest of the administration still feel that it is relevant and that it's important to make the case for the agreement. Is that right?
Secretary feels very strongly that he needs to, and this administration needs to continue to make the case.
But but really, it's no longer to Congress right now, right? Is trying to convince trying to sway public opinion, or is it still?
Well, again, it's trying to build support and obviously solidify support where that support already exists.
Right.
And that's relevant to Congress, but certainly more broadly to the American public. Go ahead.
You're not giving up at 34,
No,
correct?
no,
I mean,
absolutely
wouldn't you
not.
much rather have the largest amount of support?
course.
And wouldn't you rather have 41 so you can block a motion to proceed, so you don't even have to face a vote?
Well, again, we're looking for the maximum amount of support we can possibly get.
Do you support a vote in Congress?
Do I?
You support a vote in Congress over the deal?
Well, again, I'm not going to get into the congressional tactics here and gaming it out. We're very pleased with the support that we've seen thus far. Those senators who've come out and members of Congress who've come out publicly in support of the deal. We're going to continue to work that and try to increase those numbers.
Or would you like to see lawmakers issue a vote and be on the record for how he or she
I mean,
stands?
certainly, we'd love to see this pass in Congress, yes.
Mark, just staying on
Please,
the
go
same
ahead.
topic, and now Republicans on Capitol Hill are saying, or sources from the Republicans on Capitol Hill, they suggest that they may introduce more severe sanctions and legislations, financial and so on, after, in the fall, basically forcing Iran just to sort of walk away from the deal. Is that something that you are concerned about?
Well, again, I don't want to get into hypotheticals about what may or may not
No,
happen.
hypothetical. I mean, they're saying-
What we've always said about this deal is, first of all, sanctions relief won't come to Iran immediately if the deal is passed. It has to meet certain requirements before any type of sanctions relief related to its nuclear program can come into effect. And we've also talked about the fact that bilateral, or rather unilateral, sanctions will that are non-nuclear related will remain in effect for years to come.
But you will discourage any kind of more sanctions against individual Iranians or government agents and so on.
Again, it depends on what you're talking about. What we've said all along is that, and we've tried to separate the two baskets, if you will. We've been very clear about what this agreement is about. It's about stopping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. That said, we're not ignoring the other basket of issues, which is the fact that Iran continues to be, play a non-constructive or unconstructive role in the region. And we're certainly going to keep pressure, whether it's through sanctions or otherwise, on Iran to change its behavior in that regard. Yeah.
The cause that many of us didn't get very much sleep last night.
Sure. Are we done with Iran? Yeah.
That would be other people's emails. I'm curious about the upgrades and the frequency of upgrades. In the comments that you put out, that were put out in your name last night, you say it's routine to upgrade information to classified status during the FOIA process, happens frequently, several times a month. What is, can you be more specific about that? Because it appears to have happened 125 times over the course of the month of August. And I realize that it's unusual
It's an
because it's a
extraordinary-
large amount of material that is being released.
Sure.
So there are 4,000 redactions for classified reasons?
You're asking because
In
the
general.
example that we gave, which is, as you're right, in that on a given month, this massive
Right.
FOIA request notwithstanding, we do generally
why I
upgrade.
boiled it down to a
Exactly.
percentage.
I don't have an exact, whether that's in keeping with the regular FOIA request, how many we redact and upgrade. That's just an example to say that this is not unique to this particular review, that it happens all the time. I can try to get that for you.
Can you
Yeah.
just find out how many?
Yeah, sure.
How many, is there an average? Of
Yeah,
how
we can,
many-
we can, that's certainly, we can try to figure that out. I can't promise, but I think we can probably try to get the math for you. Yeah, please.
On this topic of the now classified emails, which I believe totals with the addition of 125 yesterday, 288. The simple question I have is why weren't those emails marked classified at the time they were sent?
Well, a couple points to make there. One is just understanding what our role in this process is, which is that, we're responding to a FOIA request to publicly release these
know, I
emails.
know.
No, let me finish, and then I'll try to answer your question, I promise. So that's where our attention is focused on, is looking at and then upgrading these before public release, which is a common, frankly, thing. That we look at these, we redact where necessary in light of the fact that they're going to be publicly released. What we've said all along is we have not found anything that was marked classified at the time that it was sent.
Right. But the question is, Mark, shouldn't it have been marked classified? Isn't it true that it was mishandled? Because now you're calling it classified, and not because this is information that has changed over time, that is magically now sensitive that wasn't then. This information was mishandled and should have been marked or should not have been sent through unclassified systems. Is that an inaccurate statement?
No, I reject that because for a couple of reasons. One is it is routine for us to look at this material, again, in light of the fact that via a FOIA process, it is going to be publicly released, that this information is sensitive and we don't want it to be publicly released. So we're going to redact necessary portions. But we're only doing that now, in the sense that we can't go back in time and judge accurately what the conditions were, what the circumstances were of that information at the time it was shared with the secretary and make a judgment on that.
But
It's
Why
just
not?
But wait a minute. But isn't it true?
It's not
but
that
isn't it
easy,
true?
man.
Isn't it true that when you, Mark Toner,
Yes.
use your unclassified email State Department system, as all these correspondence, all these 125 emails are basically based on unclassified, most of them State Department email systems. Isn't it true that you're not supposed to be sending information that could at any point be deemed classified, whether it's the lowest level of confidential or whatever? If you're going to be communicating that way, you're supposed to use alternative secure means. Isn't that true?
I mean, again, and we've talked about this a lot, and without getting into specifics, but information that was shared at the time might years later be considered to be sensitive. And again, looking at it through the prism that we're ultimately going to release it publicly, that does add an element to all of this.
Are you saying that the majority? This is my last question. The
Yeah, sure.
majority of these emails fall under that category of things that were just later deemed sensitive that weren't sensitive at the time, or isn't it true that they're just being classified now because you have to, because you're putting them on the website?
So a couple of things. One is it's very difficult for us, and I said this before, to go back and to judge what the circumstances were at the time this information was shared and to make a judgment on whether that information was classified at the time. It's not a black and white issue. It's not a clear issue. We see nothing at this point in time up till now that would indicate that any of this information was marked classified at the time.
Well, of course, but it would have been impossible to mark it classified at the time.
Not
And
necessarily.
Using an unclassified system, it would have been impossible to properly mark it classified.
But to the second part of your question is our role in this as we have processed or continue to process this tranche of emails that we've received, we're looking at how this could be perceived now upon public release. And that's been our focus here. How do we process these, and how do we ensure that any sensitive information now is redacted appropriately?
Do you think it's possible, when all is said and done and the FBI has had its look at it and everybody else whoever else is investigating this, that it could be determined that staffers within the State Department are actually responsible for mishandling and sharing this information in ways they shouldn't have?
Again, that's not for me to speak to from this podium today. Our role is to process this FOIA request. But you raise a valid point, which is that there are other investigations and reviews underway, and I would encourage you to speak to those entities to ask what they're looking at. But they could well be looking at some of these broader issues. Yeah, please, Arshad, and then I'll get to you.
Why is it harder to establish whether something should have been classified at the time it was sent than to establish, as you have just done, whether it should be classified now?
Well, again, it's
benefit of history.
no, not necessarily, because again, when it's, something might have become sensitive over time, and it's equally possible the opposite, and we see that all the time, where stuff is, material is declassified over because it's no longer considered sensitive, but equally because of, personal equities, other things we've talked about, that we deem this material should be redacted and classified, just because the circumstances now make it more sensitive. It's hard for me to give examples of that from the podium, but that's it's part of the process, and it's just the way it works. There's examples on both sides. Yeah, please.
Far more, and I would guess about 99.999% examples of information becoming
Hopefully a high
less.
percentage.
It just seems to me that the whole concept of classifying something and
I think there's
even the
examples
stuff
on
that
both
the
sides.
redactions, but the redactions in here say that they're being classified until declassification at a date certain. That date certain is never before; it's always after, which means that all information becomes less sensitive over time, not more sensitive.
Again,
And it just doesn't compute
again,
to me.
there's examples of both, but again, none of this information.
I don't think there's
But
any
none of this
examples of
information.
the
No, what you're
second.
talking about. Sorry, what you're talking about is clearly classified information becoming declassified with the passage of time. I know exactly what you're referring to. Again, let's remember that this information was not classified at the time, not marked classified at the time.
Right.
And so,
But-
that doesn't apply to it, that it would be declassified at a date certain. What we're looking at, again, through this FOIA process, we're looking at this information in terms of public release. And that adds an element to all of this. And so we redact as necessary to protect the sensitivity of that
So
information.
in other words, if it hadn't been for the FOIA request,
But this is
this
a
stuff would be
common,
still floating out there, or not, but it would be still floating out there, just as sensitive as you say it is now, but just in the ether, and no one would know about it, so it would be okay.
I don't think it would be in the ether, but
Well, it might be.
What-
I mean,
again, what I'm trying
it might
to,
have just disappeared.
what I'm trying to clarify here is that we have a process to look at this information. It's a FOIA process, and it doesn't just pertain to these emails from former Secretary Clinton. It pertains to all FOIA processes where we look at this in view of public release and redact as necessary.
Okay, so can I just
Yeah, sure.
make my plea for the taking question
Yep.
again? It's just to see, when you say that it happens frequently or several
Yeah,
times
no,
a month.
we'll work
if-
on that.
Just an idea.
May I ask you to take one other question?
Sure.
It's a question that I asked the other day, and I'd like to ask if the State Department will take a policy position on this, not with regard to former Secretary Clinton, but with regard to current and past Secretaries of State, and that is whether it is the view of the Department that the Secretary of State is bound by the rules laid out in the Foreign Affairs Manual.
Okay. I mean,
As a general principle, do they apply to the Secretary of State or not, or do they apply selectively? That's the question.
Okay, I'll get you an answer for that. Yeah, please, Luis.
Who at the State Department signed off on Secretary Clinton having her own private email account and server?
Sure. You know, my unsatisfactory but necessary answer to that is, you know, again, that's not our role in this process to really answer that question publicly. You know, that there are reviews and investigations underway that will look at possibly some of these issues is for other entities to speak to.
But do you know who signed off on her having a private server?
Who signed off on her? I don't know.
Did
Are you,
anybody?
Again, I'm not going to answer that question. I'm not going to litigate that question from the podium.
so you're saying that nobody signed off on her having a private server?
No, I'm saying, look, everyone, there were, people understood that she had a private server. I think we've talked about that in the past.
What level was that knowledge? How high did that go up in this building?
I mean, you know, you've seen from the emails, you have an understanding of people who were communicating with her, at what level they were communicating at, so
Was there anybody in this building who was against the secretary having her own private server?
I can't answer that. I
And-
can't.
and
I mean,
just-
I don't have the history, but I also don't have, you know, I don't have the authority to speak definitively to that.
But you-
Again, these are questions that are appropriate, but appropriate for other processes and reviews.
But not the State Department. She was the Secretary of State. And
No, I understand what you're asking. But frankly, you know, it's perfectly plausible, and I talked a little bit with Arshad about this yesterday, is, you know, for example, we know that the state IG is at the secretary's request, is looking at the processes and how we can do better and improve our processes. And whether they'll look at these broader questions, that's a question for them.
And just going back to Matt's point about the redactions, also in the redactions wasn't just the code for classified, but this B5, which is privileged interagency memorandum, and there were 697 emails that contain this designation. By my math, about 10% of the emails contain this designation. I was wondering why so many of the emails contain this designation.
What,
B5, this privileged interagency redaction.
I'd have to, frankly, find out more about that.
And based on those markings, I'll just describe it a little bit. Doesn't this say that there was a lot of, these documents reveal a lot of foreign policy intent and objectives of this administration, and isn't that kind of a breach of national security?
Again, you know, and we've talked a lot about this, is, you know, classification is not a black and white issue. You can talk about all of these things, foreign policy priorities, interagency communications at an unclassified and a classified level. And I can assure you, and I can assure the American people, that these kinds of decisions are made by serious professionals within the State Department, but throughout the interagency every day. And everybody receives extensive training, and everybody takes that responsibility seriously. And when there are breaches, certainly those are investigated and looked
And
at.
speaking of breaches, is the State Department confident that nobody breached the Secretary's private server?
Again, I don't have an answer for you on that. That's I don't know.
So, last
Please.
opportunity here. You don't know who signed off on Secretary Clinton having her own server?
Again, I don't personally, but I don't think it's necessarily our responsibility to say that. I think that that's for other entities to look at. Please.
Mark, is there a different classification criteria from one agency to the other, or is it like one size fits all?
That's a good question. I would say it involves more equities, and different agencies look at it in different ways, and it speaks to sources and methods and other aspects of classification that I don't want to get too deeply into. But again, many of these are, frankly, judgment calls, but you know, done by seasoned professionals who are acquainted with all the risks and whatnot. But you know, those are decisions that are made every day.
Go
ahead.
Is your evident caution and limiting the areas we're prepared to address on this reflect an expectation that this ends up in court?
Well, again, we've been clear about this, is that there's reviews underway. You know, I would refer you to those agencies for specifics about what they're looking at. But yes, I would say that, at this point, given, the ongoing reviews, that it's not appropriate for us to speak to them in any conclusive manner from here. Please, Tejina.
Going back to this, earlier question that now that you are doing this under this Freedom of Information Act, is it fair enough to say that your standards are, stricter? We are seeing more blacked out pages. Like there's one email between the secretary and I think it is Huma, where you are just giving us from and to, and there's not like that email is just, I think, an addition to the number of emails you are throwing out there. What was the reason to show that email when there's not even one word that you can show from that body?
Well, we release it because under the FOIA process, we have to release all of these documents. But with every document, we look hard, line by line, word by word, at what might be sensitive, again, with the view towards public release. Now, in this current time, not passing judgment on what it may have been or may not have been at the time, and we make that judgment.
Line by line and word by word? And you
Yes.
couldn't leave like articles in and,
Yeah, some full stops, commas.
Articles matter.
well, but I mean, if you're just gonna black the whole thing out, then, there is a point to be made there.
It's
You
it's
can
hard
make
for-
something, you can make something completely unintelligible just by taking out all the verbs and all the nouns. But you, right?
Just wipe out the whole.
I
It sounds
suppose
like
so,
Matt.
Matt.
I mean, sometimes you don't even have to
Are we
take out
really,
the verbs and the
are we
nouns to
really
make it
going there?
unintelligible.
Please, go ahead. I'm sorry?
Change
I'd love to.
Turkey.
Turkey, even if it's Turkey.
So just
Go
follow
ahead.
up from yesterday. As we all know, two Vice journalists are still arrested in Turkey. According to reports today, they have been arrested because engaging in terror activity on behalf of ISIL in Turkey. Do you have any further comment since yesterday? Have you gotten any kind of reaction from Ankara on this?
No, I mean, I would only say that, we've, just in light of the comments I gave yesterday, in which I talked about the fact that, we urge the Turkish authorities to ensure that their actions uphold universal democratic values, and that includes freedom of the press, due process, and access to media and information. We've made our views often and clearly to the Turkish government. I'm not going to get into any specific diplomatic exchanges about this case we may have had, but they're aware of our feelings about this.
There are many rights groups around the world, including Amnesty International, calling on Turkey, first of all, dubbing these charges against them bizarre, and they call on Turkey to release these journalists. Would you would you urge Turkey to release these journalists?
Well, again, we made I've made our stance on this clear.
Today, also,
One last question. Okay, we'll move around just to keep it.
there are further police raids on some private TVs.
Further? Police raids.
Security raids, yes. The private TVs and newspapers. First of all, what's your reaction? Have you seen the reports?
I've seen the reports. We certainly look to governments, including Turkey, to ensure that legal enforcement activity is done in accordance with international legal standards. And that includes full respect for due process as well as equal treatment under the law.
This seems to be everyday new cases up to the November 1st elections. There are hundreds of cases, insult cases, allegedly insulting president being arrested. Mostly pro-Kurdish party members now being arrested again. And it seems like since the U.S. has been using Turkish airbase, Incirlik airbase, with the increased partnership with Turkey, some of these cases are gone unnoticed, and U.S. is not giving the way the reaction or condemnation that's supposed to give. These are the criticism.
I wouldn't make that assumption. First of all, we're deeply appreciative of Turkey's role now in the ISIL coalition, you know, as I mentioned yesterday, they've begun flying missions, anti-ISIL missions in northern Syria. So we appreciate their contributions, as well as allowing the U.S. to use Incirlik Air Base. That's a separate piece altogether from any concerns we might have about Turkey living up to its proud democratic tradition. Turkey's a NATO ally, it's a friend, and we continue to call on it to live up to the democratic standards that it espouses.
Mark, would you like Turkey to conduct the same volume of airstrikes against ISIS as it has the PKK, notably in late July?
Again, it's first of all, in response to PKK strikes, they have or PKK attacks rather on Turkish security forces, police and military. They have, as we've said, justifiably taken action against PKK. We call on them always to use restraint. We'd like to see an end to that violence on the part of the PKK. They're just ramping up now on their anti-ISIL missions. It's hard to know how far they'll go or how much they'll increase those, but we want to see a prominent role.
Because Turkey seemed pretty ramped up to strike PKK. They used over 20 airplanes, and it seems like this strike against ISIS is just like a couple jets.
Well, again, these aren't one-off missions, and certainly what we talked about the last couple of weeks as part of this process is getting Turkey integrated into the broader coalition effort. So, you know, watch that space. Please go ahead, Saeed.
Yesterday, former General David Petraeus, former CIA head, suggested that maybe the United States should aid Jabhat al-Nusra to fight ISIS. Are you aware of that? Do you have any comment?
Yeah, I've seen the report, and I would, you know, raise an eyebrow because I think General Petraeus actually came out and said he made no comments. I think it was based on secondhand conversations that were suspect. Certainly, we're not looking to cooperate with al-Nusra. They're a designated foreign terrorist organization. Please.
Uganda?
One more of that.
Yes.
Sorry. Part of
okay.
General Petraeus' statement was he would like to see some elements from Nusra, not necessarily partnering with the whole organization, but maybe recruiting some fighters away. Do you see that as a potential?
Not at this point, no. Please.
Uganda.
Yeah.
Do you have any comment on a bill that was before the Ugandan parliament today, apparently, that would further regulate non-governmental organizations? I know LGBT rights groups in particular are concerned that, as one person told me, it would additionally institutionalize discrimination against LGBT organizing in Uganda. Do you have any comment on that?
I don't. Certainly, we'd be concerned about any proposed legislation that would further limit gay rights in Uganda or put LGBT populations in Uganda under any duress. I don't have specifics in response. If I can get those, I'll go ahead and give them to you. But you know, generally speaking, you know, we consider gay rights to be an important component of human rights writ large, and so we take those any threat to those very seriously. Please, Wendy.
Ambassador Power made reference to the journalist sentenced in Azerbaijan, Khadija, and I did see your statement from earlier. Can you elaborate on the U.S. objection to the 7.5-year sentence? And then secondly, has the U.S. expressed those concerns directly to the government?
On the issue of raising those concerns, our concerns about the sentence to the Azerbaijani government, yes, on multiple levels. We've raised those concerns, and we've raised them repeatedly. I apologize for your first question again. The first part of your question.
Can you elaborate on the U.S. objections to the sentencing?
Well, again, and if our statement, I thought it was in our statement, but we note that the court refused to review certain evidence and testimony from Ms. Ismailova's former employee, employer rather, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, that was of direct relevance to her case and to the charges, specifically to the charges of financial crimes. Let's go in the back, Michelle.
Yeah, can we go back to Syria, please?
We can go back to Syria.
Syrian refugees crisis is getting worse and worse every day after affecting the neighboring countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Turkey. It's affecting Europe today. How does the U.S. view this problem, and what is trying to, and how is it trying to help?
Well, thanks, Michelle, for that question. This is a very, as you correctly noted in your question, a very pressing issue. We've all seen news reports out of Europe, Eastern Europe, and also Greece and elsewhere of these migrants seeking asylum in parts of Europe and the European Union. It's a complex issue. It's a pressing issue. We support certainly the European Union's efforts to develop a comprehensive approach to resolve these migration challenges. There's no question that the very large number of extremely vulnerable asylum seekers coming to Europe poses a very serious and difficult challenge to the EU and the region and the nations in the region as a whole. Any solution must focus on saving and protecting lives and ensuring the human rights of all migrants are respected, as well as promoting orderly and humane migration policies. And so we would urge all the governments in the region to develop appropriate facilities that allow for proper screening of migrants and the provision of life-sustaining assistance. That's where we think the focus should be at. More generally speaking, as we've said all the time about these kinds of migration issues and asylum seekers, is we need to, ultimately providing safe haven for these individuals as they flee violence in their countries, as you noted in Syria, is a temporary solution. What we really need to do is attack the root causes. So we need to have or put in place a credible, peaceful political resolution to the conflict in Syria, so that these people can do what every refugee wants to do, which is eventually go home.
A follow-up on this, please, Mark.
Yeah, please.
There
Michelle, last question. Then, sorry.
There are voices in Europe calling for sending troops from Europe and under the UN flag to Syria to create free zones or secured zones to protect the refugees. What do you think about that?
Well, we've been clear, and we've talked about this certainly in the case of Turkey, who I might add, which I might add is a country that has absorbed some 2 million Syrian refugees over the past several years. But we've been very clear, our goal is not just to create a safe zone. We've actually avoided that terminology. What we want to do is drive ISIL out altogether and create and reestablish, frankly, political order and legitimate governance in place so that these refugees can ultimately return.
And last one for me, please. Okay. What's behind the refusal of creating secured zones? Why the U.S. refuses to create secured zones in Syria?
Again, because ultimately the goal here is not just to, drive ISIL out of a set geographic location. We want to basically destroy them. Please.
Yeah, one thing that might really reduce some of the pressure on the refugee camps in Jordan, Turkey, and Syria is the UNHCR's resettlement program. Mm-hmm. And so the United States has received referrals from the HCR, many thousands of, about up to 15,000 potential refugees that could be resettled here in the United States. Is the United States doing enough to process these things? Are you on course to take in that many refugees this year?
Well, we've talked about this in the past, and I'm just seeing if I have the current numbers in front of me. But we have taken in a number of Syrian refugees. I think, sorry, just get the current figures here. So in 2015, we've received over 17,000 Syrian refugee referrals from the UNHCR, of which approximately 1,500 have been admitted since the beginning of the conflict. but I would caveat that by saying that the United States has not set resettlement targets for specific countries. We're very likely to admit 1,500 to 1,800 Syrian refugees for permanent resettlement by the end of this fiscal year, and that number will increase for 2016, we expect.
Just to clarify.
Yeah, please.
You had gotten, in 2015, you had gotten 17,000 referrals, correct, in so far this year?
17,000.
Yep, or more than 17,000. And then you said of those, you have admitted about 1,500. Is that you since the beginning of the conflict? Does that mean you didn't admit any prior, that nobody was referred prior to this year?
I'd have to look into that. I don't think that's correct. I think we've admitted Syrian refugees before FY15, yes.
And they just
the fiscal year ends in 30 days. So you think you're going to get up to?
Well, you said 15 to 1,800.
Yeah, exactly.
So you think 1,500 to 1,800 in the next 30 days?
No,
yeah.
You've already taken 1,500.
We've already taken approximately 1,500. So yeah, I'm sorry.
So 300,000. I mean 3,000.
It's an estimate, but yes.
I think we should
By the end of the month. Are you banning me from doing math?
I think we should all be banned from doing math.
I think I made an explicit request yesterday not to make me do math from the podium, Matt.
Anyway,
I thought you would honor that request.
But when you said the end of this fiscal year, you meant the end of
I meant the end of this month, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, if I was good at math, I would not be here. But I have one more refugee question,
Sure,
if I
go
may.
ahead.
I drew to your attention, but I don't know if you've had a chance to get an answer, whether the U.S. government has a position on privately run refugee centers that are contracted out by the Australian government to a private company, but that do not permit external visits by human rights groups. Do you have anything on that?
I would, refer you to the Australian government for more details specific to that question. But we encourage all countries to work with the UNHCR, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, to find adequate, durable solutions for refugees and asylum seekers, and to uphold obligations under the 1951 Refugee Convention, as well as the 1967 Protocol relating to the status of refugees.
And does that include letting international observers like the UN inspect camps to make sure that they are well run?
I believe so.
Thanks.
Historically, the United States has taken about 50% of the refugees for resettlement from the HCR, but you're short of that in the Syrian conflict.
Well, right, and a couple of points to make on that. One is that, as I thought I made clear, is that we don't typically do our process. We just don't assign. We don't say we're going to take X amount from Syria per se. We don't assign country quotas. The other thing is, frankly, is that it's a very rigorous review process to approve these asylum seekers coming from Syria, and which involves a very rigorous security check. So that takes time, and then lastly, as I said, ultimately, well, two other points. One is that we are, I think, the largest provider of humanitarian assistance, in providing humanitarian assistance and protection to these asylum seekers. I think we provided over $4 billion in humanitarian aid since the beginning of the conflict in Syria, and this is to the millions of refugees in Turkey and elsewhere where they've relocated. But then ultimately, as I said in response to Michelle, the ultimate goal here is we need to, create the conditions where these refugees can return. That's obviously the. Let's go to you and to you, Michael, and I'll get back to you, Tijender. Go ahead, please, sir. Yeah. Are we done with Syria?
Syria, no, one question.
Oh, I apologize. Okay, let's finish with Syria, and then I'll get to you.
There are some media reports out of the Middle East that the United States is considering to establish some sort of command and control base in northern Syria to make the fight that YPG is taking against ISIS more effective. Is that true?
I don't have anything to announce or even to say about that. I would.
Is that an option that you would be willing to consider?
I'm not going to deal with the hypotheticals. What we're actually doing right now is working with Turkey, flying more airstrikes out of Incirlik. We believe that's taking the fight in support of these anti-ISIL fighters in northern Syria. Okay, you, sir. Yeah. Let's finish with Syria, and then we'll go. I apologize.
I want to
Do you
change
have a Syria?
topics.
Quick one on
Okay,
Syria,
go
and
ahead.
then I just want to exhaust that issue.
Is the State Department concerned about reports that Russia is sending fighter jets to Syria to strike ISIS, or do you welcome this development? And if so, how would you coordinate with the Russians?
So I spoke to this a little bit yesterday. We're frankly still chasing the ground truth on that. We've seen those reports. I think I said yesterday that, in response to questions we got last week about, frankly, in response to some Russian officials saying, we need to take the fight to ISIL. We're already doing that. There's a 37 some odd country coalition that's taking the fight to ISIL. We would welcome Russia to be more involved in that effort.
And going back to the General Petraeus news, does the State
That was
Department...
two questions.
Excuse
Okay.
me. Does the State Department believe that there is a moderate opposition in Syria that
Yes.
the United States government can...
Yes, but we've talked again, and we've talked all along about the fact that we need to find, and that moderate Syrian opposition needs to coalesce and come together in order to form a more united front.
Who are these groups? Do you know?
Well, I mean, there's several. I can get into the details, but they are out there. But they need to find their voice and they need to unify. What's that? I promised this gentleman here.
I'll follow.
Okay. Okay. So.
Question on Japan. So the lower house speaker, Tadamori Oshima, met with UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon yesterday. And Japan has been critical about Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General, going to China to attend the 70th anniversary of the war ceremonies, saying that it undermines the neutrality of the UN. Do you agree with that assessment?
That it undermines the neutrality of the UN
by attending
for
these
the
ceremonies.
UN. We've been very clear about our perspective on this commemoration event that's taking place tomorrow, I think, in Beijing. We think it's appropriate to honor the tremendous sacrifices of those who fought and died in that tragic war. But our focus, just as we stated on VE Day, our focus is on the future. And our focus is what happened after the war, where we've seen a sustained period of peace, prosperity, partnership with Asia. And we want to see that continue to grow and solidify and bring in a new era of peace and prosperity.
Thank you.
Please, go ahead. Let's finish this topic.
What do you believe the role of the UN is in commemorating historical events?
Well, it's for the UN to decide. I think the UN is can speak to what role it wants to play. It's a body comprised of all the nations of the world. I think it stands for the fact that all nations can come together in the pursuit of dialogue to discuss issues of importance and vital interests of the world. And so, what the UN symbolizes, I think, speaks for itself. Please,
Ukraine. On the Ukraine clashes yesterday,
Yep.
you called for a full investigation, and those responsible should be held accountable. The Ukraine Interior Minister, he doesn't need to conduct an investigation in his eyes. He knows, he says he knows exactly who did it. It's members of the Svoboda political party and their leader. He has photos, videos. He said these guys were wearing T-shirts with logos on it. I mean, they weren't really hiding it. And yesterday you deplored the violence. Do you condemn it? It sounds like this is an attack.
I mean, look, I don't know if I could have been clearer yesterday. I mean, first of all, we welcome the actual vote by Ukraine's parliament on these draft constitutional amendments on decentralization. This is a key component of them continuing to fulfill their Minsk commitments. Something, frankly, we haven't. Sorry, let me finish, Michael. We haven't seen on the part of the separatists or Russia. And then, secondly, we strongly deplore the violence that took place in the aftermath of that vote. It resulted in many injuries among law enforcement authorities, and our condolences to those who were injured and killed. And we call on the government to fully investigate this. If they feel they have evidence and proof of who was at fault here,
that's what they're saying.
Then they need to obviously, through due process, investigate this incident and hold those people accountable.
And
Certainly.
this was in
Yeah, go ahead.
reaction to the draft amendment.
Correct.
This violence. Are you concerned
God bless you.
once the real thing gets implemented, what that could look like? And that could undermine the Minsk process overall, not to be flip.
No, I mean, I think, look, I think we have confidence in Ukraine's government and in their law enforcement agencies to be able to provide security. But, you know, this is ultimately something for the Ukrainian people. You know, those who stood on the Maidan through the long winter months to make their case to the government that was then in place, that they wanted more democracy, they wanted greater economic prosperity, greater engagement with Europe. You know, they need to stand up and speak for themselves and to make their feelings known. And we, as I said, we support fully people's right for peaceful assembly and protest. But once you have violence enter into it, then
The draft,
it
the
changes
problem
it.
with the draft, one more thing is.
Yeah, please.
He was able to secure that with 265. He got 265 of the vote. But to make it law, he'll need 300 eventually. Now, October elections could change, you know, but that's a big gap. Are you worried? You know, you congratulate him here, but aren't you worried that this thing may never happen?
Boy, I mean, Matt was trying to get me in the congressional, you know, whip counting for the Iran deal vote, but no, I'm not.
Familiar with Ukraine's
That's right.
parliament?
You don't know the
So
route?
no, I was just going to say I'm certainly not going to wade into Ukrainian parliamentary vote counts. Look, this is democracy in action. It's up to the Ukrainian government to make its case. So we'll leave it to them.
A
Couple more questions. Yes,
two quick questions.
Yep,
on
please.
The Palestinian issue. Are you aware that the Israelis raided a Palestinian refugee camp, Jenin, last night? The raid is still ongoing, using a tactical pressure cooker, where they demolished 3 homes in pursuit of 3 Palestinian suspects. Are you aware of that?
Sid, I have to say I'm not.
Okay.
No,
All right,
I'll
well,
look into it.
And the flip side of that, it's been 31 days since Israeli terrorist settlers attacked the village of Douma, killing, you know, a Palestinian baby,
Yes.
his
And
father,
his
his
father,
mother,
yeah.
and so on.
Mother, yeah.
And at the time, you expressed confidence that Israel has the wherewithal to pursue the terrorist perpetrators and bring them to justice. Yet we don't see this kind of raiding of the settlement to bring the perpetrators to justice. Are you still satisfied that Israel is doing all it can to apprehend the terrorist suspects in the settlement?
Well, again, we spoke very clearly at the time and continue to condemn that kind of violence, that kind of activity, and call on for a full investigation and to bring the perpetrators to justice. Now, you know, we know, and we speak to this often, that, you know, a full investigation takes time. The Prime Minister, the government was very clear in expressing their outrage about this violence and the need to address it. So let's wait and let this process play out.
And the point being that, you know, when the Israelis expressed their outrage going into Jenin to apprehend someone, but we have not seen anything similar to that in the settlement where the settlers have suspected or are suspected to come from.
I'm sorry, so you have not seen
No,
us
I'm saying,
express?
no, we have not. We have not seen
I just
anything.
haven't, I'm not aware of the incident.
Are you in touch with the Israelis on these things? Are you coordinating with them? I mean, you have a great deal of law enforcement and, you know, security coordination with them. Are you coordinating with them, in fact, operationally or otherwise, to bring these suspects to justice?
You're talking about in the
Yes.
the attacks
those
on the
suspected,
Palestinian,
right,
yeah.
yes.
I don't know if we're actually cooperating them on this case, but we have every confidence that they're able to carry out this investigation.
are.
Let the process play
So you
out.
have every confidence that the Israelis can bring these perpetrators to
Yes.
justice.
Can we stay in the
different-
region?
Go ahead,
but,
yeah, and then we'll get to
I have 2 brief ones. One,
Sure.
I don't know if you've addressed this when I'm not here, but you know there's an effort by the Palestinians at
Yes,
the
no,
UN to get their flag
Sorry.
to raise their flag at the UN. I would have asked Ambassador Power, but
Yeah, boy, what an
She,
opportunity there. Missed opportunity.
took off. Do you guys have a position on that?
On the,
Yeah.
on the
On a
flag.
Palestinian request to have their flag. I mean, they are now recognized as a member of the General Assembly.
Yes.
Yes, what?
We do have a, you know.
Is it yes, no?
Let
Yes,
me
we have a
finish. Let me
position, no, they
finish.
can't.
We continue to believe that Palestinian efforts to pursue statehood or endorsements of statehood claims through the UN system that are outside of a negotiated settlement we believe those actions to be counterproductive.
And that would include raising the flag?
Yes.
It would. Okay. The Vatican has got which has the same status as the Palestinian Authority does at the General Assembly, has got a similar request. They've distanced themselves from the Palestinian one, but it's been an ongoing thing, and particularly because the Pope is going to be there this year, who is a head of state, and if I'm not mistaken, is going to be on a state visit, or at least a papal visit here, which is pretty much the equivalent of a state visit, getting greeted by the president and all that kind of thing. I'm wondering if the U.S. has the same position on the Vatican flag going up as it does with the Palestinians, or is it just an entirely different case because the Vatican is already recognized? You already recognize the Vatican as a state.
I'll double check on that, but my sense is that you answered the question, which is it's entirely different.
So
case.
in the absence of any...
Excuse me, Sam. Then also related to the UN and the Palestinian issue, are you aware of this latest surge in criticism of UNRWA and calls by some in Israel for it to be investigated, that kind of thing?
I'm not. I have to.
I didn't think you
I'll
would.
look into it. Yeah, please.
Could you take a look?
Yeah,
Thanks.
no worries.
short
TJ,
one
you've been
on
waiting a
India.
long time. I apologize.
A short one on India. Is there any diplomatic fallout from the release of that 12-page secret document of the CIA yesterday, which made headlines in India and other places about saying that then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi wanted to bomb the Pakistani nuclear sites when she became the second time the Prime Minister.
TJ, I apologize. I'm not aware of the document. Are you talking about recent release of this document?
Yesterday it made big headlines. That
apologize,
12-page secret document of the CIA, and so there were no phone lines.
I was preoccupied by other
the emails,
questions of classification and non-classification. No, I'm sorry. I don't have any comment. Please.
Different topic on China. Yeah. About Ambassador David Saperstein visit to China, who is in charge of the international religious freedom. As you released a statement yesterday, firstly, let me ask about. Could you tell me the reason why Ambassador visited China at this time and raised a deep concern against the violation of the religious freedom at this moment?
I'm sorry. So
is
you're
that,
talking?
The United States government is, investigating regularly, or is this the first time?
But I'm sorry. Who could you just mention? You're talking about
Ambassador David Saperstein.
Yeah, no, I am aware of that. I'm not sure I have anything on his visit, though. I apologize. I'll try to find out more about it.
Okay, I believe U.S. government is going to raise a concern when President Xi Jinping visit this town. But as we all know, on these human rights and religious freedom, there are significant differences between the United States and China. So how are you gonna, the United States government raise concern and have a constructive discussion on this issue?
On religious freedom?
Yeah.
Well, just like we try to have constructive discussions on difficult issues across the board with China, including human rights, as Ambassador Power just spoke to. We believe strongly as a country, as a nation, in religious freedom, and we would call on all countries to allow people to their own citizens to worship as they see fit, and that's a matter of concern to us, ongoing concern. Last question, guys.
So I'd like to know about the fair assessment of the United States government. The situation of the religious freedom in China is getting better or getting more serious since the last investigation.
Well,
last couple of
I
years.
can't give you an overall assessment. It's something we do watch closely. Certainly, our human rights report speaks to it. Our annual human rights report speaks to it. I can say that it is an ongoing concern, and specifically, just to cite a recent case, prominent Christian human rights lawyer Zhang Kai and his assistant, they were detained by the Chinese authorities. We certainly want to see him released, but this is just indicative of an ongoing pattern that we've seen. Last question in the back.
I want to go back to Turkey and media issue because
Turkey
and media issue.
Media issue, sorry,
because my newspaper today, police raided all day, and I don't know what will happen tomorrow. According to some source, especially from government, they are going to take over all critical media because we have some information about that. And have you related with Turkish government or communicate with Turkish government specifically about this issue? Because today they police raided 2 newspapers, 2 TV channel, and all our newspaper raided today, and maybe tomorrow another one, maybe day after another one, and especially before election.
Well, as I said, we've made clear in the past and continue to make clear of our concern about Turkish government interferences with freedom of expression and assembly, as well as the importance in the administration of due process and justice. I spoke to that already, talking about some of these raids that you referred to, that any kind of law enforcement, legal enforcement activity is done in accordance with international legal standards. And we would urge Turkey to follow those standards in this and any other case. Thank you very much.
Thank you.